Hey, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dustin Lambert, adjunct instructor here at Pierpont Community Technical College. I'd like to welcome you all to EMMS 1109, the Intro to Workplace Safety course. And this first presentation is going to be a little background on why we even care about safety in the workplace, what the big deal is, and some tools, basic just theories that we use as safety professionals to reduce risk in the workplace. All right, so who cares about all this safety stuff anyway, besides me, who is a safety geek? Of course, nobody wants to get hurt at work or anywhere for that matter, but let's do a little rundown, some history stuff here. So 1911, textile mill in New York City called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Mostly immigrant workers, women and children working in a textile mill. As you can imagine there wasn't any real laws as far as child labor or, safety, amount of hours worked, nothing like that. So a lot of immigrant workers finishing up for the day on March 25th. So to keep all the people working steadily in this factory, the owners didn't really want any doors easily accessible because they would go out on the fire escapes and balconies and take breaks. Well, you couldn't have that. So to remedy it, they put chains and locks around those doors and only had one stairwell in and out for all of these people working in the factory. So March 25th, 1911, fire broke out in a rag bin on the 8th floor. And this happened pretty often. Usually they were able to snuff it out by throwing some water on it, but this day it spread quicker than normal. And the fire quickly spread up the stairwell to the 9th floor. And of course, in 1911, even though they had been invented, there were no sprinklers installed. There was no requirements for it. There was no alarms, no fire escapes. Well, like I said, they were chained shut. And a few hundred deaths, or a few hundred injuries rather, 146 deaths, led to some changes in New York City, at least first. So NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, around that time, was already in existence, but came up with the first life safety codes. So they came up with a set of rules or recommendations that the doors not be chained shut, and you have fire escapes, and you have a certain number of doors and escapes for people to get out of upper floors. And then New York City and many other cities quickly adopted these as law. So let's fast forward to West Virginia. 1927, down in the southern part of the state, the Hawk's Nest Tunnel was being drilled. Not a lot of big machinery in 1927, so a lot of this was dug by hand. Tons of immigrant workers, again, digging this waterway to go around a dam for the spillways. So as they were digging through this rock, they got into a batch of silica, which silica is used for a little bit of everything nowadays. But the bad thing about it is whenever you put that into the air, into a powder form, it causes a disease called silicosis. And silicosis, deadly lung disease, there was 109 people who died making this tunnel that they admitted to, but the estimates actually ended up were closer to 400 that later researchers indicated. So then right here in Marion County, for those of you who are actually in Fairmont area or go to school here, there's a couple mine disasters that you may have heard of that really contributed to laws and things that affect us now. So Monongah, just south of Fairmont in 1907, there's 362 recorded deaths after an explosion in a coal mine there. There was, again, estimated way more than that. At the time, there was a lot of coal miners who would take their kids to work with them, their sons, because the more coal they got, the more money they got. So the actual numbers are thought to be considerably higher than that. And then fast forward to 1968, more recent history. In Farmington, just north of Fairmont, there was another mine explosion, collapse that led to 78 deaths. 1968, the Bureau of Mines had been created mainly because of the Monongah mine disaster, but the 68 disaster led to just a few years later creation of MSHA, the Mine Safety and Health Administration. So now, while this isn't an exhaustive list, of course, you can tell that there's a lot of events that happened over the last 100 years or so that led to the creation of some of our laws that affect our safety in the workplace. So let's talk about OSHA. 1970, Congress gets together and they decide that they have had enough push from industry and trade unions, and there's enough fatalities and injuries in the workplace every year that they're going to come up with the Occupational Safety and Health um, Act. So this act in 1970 led to the creation of the administration in 1971. Years don't really matter, but only about 40 some years ago. So the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, under the executive branch, under the president's branch, has the ability to come into your workplace, to do inspections, to look at pretty much any process that you have in your workplace, to look at paperwork and records of injuries and accidents, and they can cite you based on what they find, based on the code. They also have free reign to create their own standards, their own regulations, without having to go through Congress or any other entity. So there are some exemptions. Government agencies like state, federal, local, municipal governments can't be cited under the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, under OSHA, but they are obligated to abide by those same rules that everybody else is. So you may have heard the term OSHA state and non-OSHA state. A lot of confusion there. All that means is that an OSHA state has came up with their own rules for occupational safety and health. So in West Virginia, we are not an OSHA state. So if an inspector comes in or you get cited for a deficiency, that's going to be by the federal government. So the federal government enforces all the occupational safety and health regulations in our state versus maybe California, which has a very stringent, strict state OSHA program. Chances are there, the federal government doesn't do a whole lot, and the state pretty much runs their more strict program. So this rulemaking process that I mentioned, OSHA can make their own regulations. As you can imagine, industries and processes, all this stuff changes pretty often. So in order to keep up, they can't really wait on lawmakers and Congress to make a new rule every time that something changes. So we can see that that doesn't happen very quickly. So they can get together, they propose a new rule, and they'll put it out for public review, and people who are affected by it can give feedback on it, or whether it makes sense, or whether they can meet it, or if it's going to be too expensive. And then they'll review that and decide whether or not it's going to become a regulation. So regulation is something you have to abide by. It's just like law. Now there's different regulations for different industries. So you can see over on the right side here is a general industry regulation and standards. You can see just on the black area, that's the name of that one. So that's 29 CFR 1910. There's other books, entire books like this, that are for other specialty industries, like construction, maritime. They're going to be put out for industries that are very unique, that are separate from normal run-of-the-mill factory or hospital or school or anywhere else like that. So really important, the number one and most important rule in all of these is the general duty clause. So this clause was created by Congress, and this is what OSHA is completely built on. So the first part says that each employer has to give a safe workplace free from known hazards. And the second part says that each employee shall abide by any standards put out under this act. So what this means really to us is that if we're in a workplace and there's not a specific rule against a process or something that's happening, you still can be cited. The employer still can be cited and have a fine, even though it's not specifically outlined in the OSHA regulations. And the B at the bottom says that the employees, of course, are required to abide by the rules and regulations, even though that citing an actual employee, to my knowledge, hasn't happened. So really unlikely to happen. All right, so that's the legal side of it. We are required to be safe on the legal side, but all right, so that's all great. We know that by law in the workplace, we have to be provided with a safe place to work, and we as employees, if we are employees, have to abide by those rules. So that's all fine and dandy, but how do we actually be safe? Because we can abide by all those rules and still technically not be safe. So I like to use car crashes as an example because it may or may not be part of your job, but we pretty much all ride in cars at some point. So let's get a few definitions and just discuss some basic theories. So what is safe? What is safe to you? Do you feel safe right now where you're at? So let's define it by the state of being reasonably free of hazards. Because it's impossible to be completely free of hazards, whether you realize it or not. Even sitting there in your house or in your living room or in a classroom, there's still hazards. There still could be a meteor fall out of the sky, or the building could collapse. There's always potential for harm. So we want to aim to be reasonably free of these hazards, because it's impossible to be perfectly safe, if we're going to be honest. So what are hazards? Well, we all think we know. So actions or conditions that increase likelihood of injury or damage. So actions, that means that people doing stupid things could be a hazard, or a condition, something that is maybe defective or wasn't designed properly, that increases the likelihood of injury or damage. So injury being possibility of somebody getting hurt, and then damage being stuff like this, damage to a car or a machine in your workplace or the workplace itself, whichever. So any hazard can cause those two things. So how do we fix it? So we increase safety by reducing risk and reducing these hazards. So we want to control these hazards. So we're looking for the actions by people or the conditions around them that could cause injuries or damage. But which hazards do we focus on? All right. So we've got a car crash up here, and we're going to call this a fatal car crash. By the way, this whole thing that I'm about to draw here is called a Heinrich ratio. Don't really need to know that, but pretty neat. So one fatal accident. We've got a car crash. We'll say that this new intersection in town, and you're put in charge of determining what happened with that. So one car crash, and you're going to look at it, and you're going to say, okay, well, this person maybe ran a red light, or maybe they ran through a stop sign and got struck by another vehicle. But then you start looking back through records, and you realize that at the same exact intersection, there were 10 other incidents that nobody died, but they had some pretty serious injuries. So nobody really noticed those, though. And then you look back even further, and you start counting up, and you realize that there's dozens of minor incidents here that really nobody was hurt, but they were some little fender benders. And then you start counting that there was, looking at some surveillance cameras, and realize that there was hundreds of near misses where there was almost crashes, but it didn't really happen. And then leading up to those near misses, you could pretty much bank on that there were thousands of bad habits or unsafe conditions that really never had the near miss, but it just didn't happen on those instances. So it's really easy to be reactive, and you say, okay, well, this caused a fatal crash and they were not paying attention, so we need to outlaw whatever they were doing, and that's going to solve the problem. When really, we need to be looking down here at these thousands of bad habits or unsafe conditions and try to control those. It is really hard to draw with a mouse, by the way, so I apologize that it looks like a 3-year-old. Okay. So why do these car crashes happen? Well, we determined, of course, it's by people or conditions. So, maybe everybody's brakes go out at that particular place. Unlikely, but could be. So for every accident, incident, crash, any damaging event, safety people usually stay away from the word accident because it implies it's sort of an act of God and it's out of our control. So we're going to call it incidents, and I'll try to stick with that term. So each incident, believe it or not, even though you may have faulted it back to a single thing, has multiple causes. So if you're walking across the room and you trip over your shoelace and you fall and you strike your head off of a desk, believe it or not, multiple things had to line up in order for that to happen. And that's called the Swiss cheese theory. So what this means is that you might have walked across that same room dozens of times with your shoelace untied, but you knew it was there and you were able to not step on your shoelace that time. Or you may have walked across the room with your shoelace untied, tripped, but you never actually fell. You caught yourself. So shoelace walks across the room on this event, and it stops right here on this one. So it gets stopped by the fact that you never stepped on it. Versus this time down here, you walk across the room with your shoelace untied, and you trip over it, and you fall, but you don't hit your head because it's stopped by this chain of events is stopped by the fact that the table was in a different place. But then a few days later, you're walking across the room again with your shoelaces untied, and everything lines up. You step on your shoelace, you're not able to catch yourself, you fall forward, the table happens to be in the right place, and all the Swiss cheese holes line up, and you smack your head off of it and get knocked out. So no matter what event it is, there's pretty much an entire chain of events that you may not realize that happens. So how do we prevent it? Well, we look again at the Heinrich ratio, that pyramid of statistics that happens for each type of event. For every fatal car crash, there's lots of fender benders. For every fender bender, there's lots and lots of close calls and minor accidents and bad habits. So that's what we need to control, are those bad habits and those poor engineering designs. So we control this by using the hierarchy of engineering controls. So we're going to talk about that. But first, let's look at this Swiss cheese theory in action. So I like to use this very gory, so be warned, clip from Final Destination. I think it's Final Destination 2. So any car crash, people will look at it and be like, oh, okay, they were driving too fast, and that was the cause of the crash. Or they were talking on their phone, and that was the cause of the crash. Or their tires were bald. So now that we know about this Swiss cheese theory, let's actually look at this horribly over theatrical crash and see if we can determine what actually went wrong. So first thing,
hey, I think we better pull over and check the car because it...
Kimberly, the car is gonna be fine. Your dad's
we probably all drive around with check engine lights on.
You're gonna be fine.
No big deal.
Okay?
Drive hundreds of miles with that on. Let's see if that's a contributing factor here. Got some wet road conditions. Not everybody who drives on a wet road crashes. Got a motorcyclist doing what we like to do. Be stupid, driving too fast because it's fun as a kid.
Look at that guy.
Truck driver, drinking and driving.
Beer.
He may have driven hundreds of miles like that and never crashed.
Oh yeah, that's real responsible.
She puts her seatbelt on at least. So there's that. We're up to 4 things now. Not an actual factor, but creepy kid with a premonition. I don't know. That didn't have anything to do with it.
You ever hear of the ozone layer, asshole?
Hot coffee, no lid. Police officers join in on the bad habits here. More drug use. That's being seen from Super Troopers.
What? On my seatbelt? You gonna bust me, bitch?
Wet roads, motorcycles driving too fast, hot coffee with no lid on it. All things that people do all the time, and nothing usually happens. And last thing, we've got a chain hanging off that log truck in case you didn't see that. So, coffee spills, log truck was not properly tied down, and now the Swiss cheese holes are lining up. Like I said, it's pretty gory. Good news is cars usually don't really blow up like that when they crash. Bad brakes on her car, check engine light, no seat belts, loose water bottle. They must have been hauling gasoline in the cabin here.
Gina.
All right, so fortunately she wakes up and it was just a dream, not based on a true story. Although there have been multiple car pileups in dense fog and bad weather that have led to, multiple fatalities and multiple huge amounts of injuries because the holes in the Swiss cheese lined up. All right, so how do we control these things? We might think to ourselves, okay, we can control that crash by putting a lid on a coffee, or everybody wearing their seat belts, or maybe just slowing down. A lot of different ways we could have controlled that. But thinking about all the different ways that we can make a hazard safer in the workplace, there's an order of preference that we want to go by to fix these, because some solutions are better than others, of course. So thinking back to the car crash, I guess we can use that as an example maybe. Let's see here. So we call this the hierarchy of controls. So at the top of this hierarchy is elimination, or physically removing the hazard. So in the case of that clip, driving cars is hazardous, as we all know. So maybe we could replace all cars with trains or public transit, which is pretty asinine to consider, but it is safer to ride a subway or metro or a train than it is to drive cars, because we, as much as we hate to admit it, are horrible drivers for the most part. So elimination in the workplace might be you have a machine that people have gotten injured, or a process that people have gotten injured using, and you stand back and you think to yourself, do we really need to actually do this? Is there something that we could, a different type of machine or a different type of process that we could replace it with to just completely eliminate that hazard out of our workplace? And this is the most effective way of controlling it. So if we could get rid of cars off the highway altogether, then of course we're going to eliminate car crashes. Well, that's not really an option, right? So second on the list is substitution. Substitution is usually seen in like when you have a hazardous chemical in the workplace. Maybe you use some sort of acid to wash parts or to sterilize tools, and you start shopping around and realize for just a few extra bucks a gallon you could get something that's not an acid and doesn't have any hazardous effects if you would happen to get it in your eye. So if we can't eliminate the process altogether or eliminate the hazard, then we substitute it with a more safe option. And third is engineering controls. So these are usually when you still have the hazard there and you still are going to have people around that hazard, you implement an engineering control. So an engineering control, think of your washer and dryer at home. Whenever it's running and it's on a spin cycle and you open up the lid, what happens? Hopefully it stops spinning, right? So that's called an interlock, and that's an engineering control. What other engineering controls can you think of? What if the doors lock on your car as soon as you put it into drive? Or the headlights come on when you put it into drive? Those are engineering controls that you don't really have any control over that make those processes safer. So that's third, but still pretty high on the options list. And then we've got administrative controls. So when we get down to this part, we're affecting people. So we got to change the way people work. So we either make them or hope that they do the job in a safer manner. So that might mean, okay, don't go past this line and get near this main eating machine. Or it might mean you're only working with this chemical for 1 hour at a time every week. So thinking back to our vehicle accident, the crash that we saw, administrative controls are in place, right? We've got tons and tons of laws or rules that affect how we're supposed to drive. And as you can imagine, they don't work very well. The bad thing about that is because we get people involved and people don't like obeying rules, or we're lazy, and we usually just work around whatever administrative controls get put into place. Something else that falls into this realm is going to be training. Managers love to throw training at employees. They're like, oh, somebody got hurt, we need to retrain everybody, or we had a near miss, let's send everybody to remedial training on this process. But chances are everybody that was there or that was involved may have already known exactly what they were supposed to be doing. They just decided not to do it. So training usually isn't the answer either, or isn't always the answer. Then at the bottom of the list is PPE, or personal protective equipment, which is discussed later on separately in this class. So PPE, often by misinformed managers, is the first thing that they like to throw at a hazard. If there's something dangerous or somebody gets hurt, they say, oh, we need more safety glasses and gloves and hard hats and steel-toe boots. They don't actually look at the process and think to themselves, can we make an engineering control, or can we get rid of this process altogether and have a safer process to where we don't need that PPE? The reason that PPE is the least preferred, and why it's cleared out on the bottom, is because the hazards still exist. We haven't replaced it. It's still as hazardous as ever. It's able to get close to the person, clear up against their skin usually. If we're wearing safety glasses or any other type of PPE, that has to be put on the person. So the hazard still exists. It's going to clear up against the person before it's getting stopped. And of course it could fail. So that's why that's no good. And then the last, and again, main reason, similar to administrative controls, is it involves people. So people suck. We don't obey rules like we should. We're inherently lazy. When nobody's looking, we like to find the quickest way to get the job done, and usually that's at the risk of safety. So that's the order of ways that we want to control hazards in the workplace. Always start up here and use this as a last resort, absolute last resort, when nothing else, absolutely nothing else is available. So I'm a firefighter full-time in Fairmont here, and firefighters have to wear PPE because we can't get rid of the hazard of going into burning buildings. In the medical field, you have to wear gloves because we haven't came up with a robot or a machine to replace people that get exposed to possible bloodborne pathogens. So in a lot of areas, PPE is still relied on because we haven't came up with a better system yet, an engineering control or a substitution control or elimination control to get rid of those hazards. So sometimes that's all we have to work with. So let's use a scenario here. What would you do? You're working in a hospital where you've got autoclaves. That device there on the left, you put surgical utensils in it, and it gets them really hot and sterilizes them for the next use, kills any germs on them. So you had an employee that went over to the autoclave to remove some utensils after they had been sterilized. And for the third time in the past 2 weeks, she burns her hand on the inside of the oven on the utensils as she's taking them out. So how could we go about using what we know so far to remedy this problem? So thinking back to our hierarchy of controls, I don't know much about autoclaves, but this one looks like it's pretty dated. So how would we go about fixing this situation? We look at data and realize that this has happened numerous times over the years, and it's just a matter of time before somebody gets some serious burns more than just these minor burns. So what's your first option? Well, if we think back, maybe we should replace this device with a newer model. Maybe we need to replace the whole process altogether. So do we really need to be sterilizing tools here at all? Maybe we could ship them off to a third party and let them handle that hazard. If that's not an option, if we have to do this process, then maybe we should update the autoclave to a newer model that doesn't allow the door to actually open until the tools are cool enough to touch safely. So that would always be an option, preferable. Moving on down the line, an option might be to put some sort of warning device, like a sticker that says danger hot, or even a light that turns on whenever the tools are hot. The problem with that is those are sort of administrative controls. It falls back onto the employee to do the right thing and obey that sticker or obey that light, which, like I said, we generally don't obey it. Just like speed limit signs along the interstate, we don't like to do it. And then, of course, the last and least preferable, which everybody might want to throw at it, is be like, go get some heat-resistant gloves. Have them just wear these gloves while they take the pans in and out of the oven, and that'll remedy the problem. Well, again, the hazard's still there, the tools are still hot, and it relies on the person actually putting the gloves on. So that would be the least preferred method. So let's use one more scenario here that might be pretty realistic. So anybody that works in the healthcare field, especially in a hospital or emergency medical services, knows that pretty much one of the biggest injuries on the job is back injuries. If you ever hurt your back, you know that it can leave you off work for quite some time and lead to huge issues down the road. So you're put in charge of a new area, and you realize after looking back through patient incident reports that you have had a ton of back injuries and people off work with back injuries. So how do you go about fixing it? The number one thing that these people were doing is moving patients around and helping patients up. So how do you go about remedying this type of scenario? So your boss decides to have a meeting on all of these back injuries that you mentioned, and everybody gathers together and discusses some different possible solutions for how we're going to go about fixing these back injuries. So one person speaks up and says, hey, I know, I went to Lowe's the other day and saw everybody wearing these back belts, and it gives them support and it keeps them from hurting their backs. So let's just buy everybody these back belts. They can wear them under their scrubs. They don't have to look silly like this. And that'll solve the problem. Then they won't have all that force on their backs while they're lifting and moving patients. And somebody else speaks up and says, no, we need to retrain all the people on how to properly lift a patient from bed to bed, how to move them around without hurting your back. So what is the actual right answer? Well, somebody else speaks up and says, hey, how about we design and purchase these lifts for heavy patients and just completely eliminate lifting patients altogether? So let's discuss these options. The back brace is almost like PPE, right? It's going to require the person to put it on, to wear it correctly before it's going to work. So the hazard's still there. So not preferable, which, by the way, Lowe's doesn't use these anymore. It hasn't for years because they learned that it actually causes your back muscles to get weaker, and then whenever you do eventually lift something like a coffee can, it screws up your back way worse than it would have otherwise. So that's always a bad idea. And then the always famous, we just need to retrain everybody on how to properly lift people. And maybe so. Maybe a lot of these injuries were because of poor lifting technique. So that's always an option, but chances are people don't like changing their habits, and chances are that they're going to continue lifting, and even with good lifting technique, you can only lift so much. So that is not the best option. And of course, the best option out of all these is going to be to completely eliminate the hazard of lifting patients altogether. So it might cost more money, and the hospital or the agency you work for doesn't want to spend that money. So you've got to justify that maybe. You might have to show them that, hey, over the last year, there's been 12 people off with back injuries, and the amount of money that we spent in workers' comp claims and our insurance rates, we could have bought all these. And that's the right solution. Engineer out the hazard.